Hey everyone, and welcome back to Key Safety Talks. Today we're going to be tackling something super important for anyone who works with chemicals.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Whether you're in a lab, a factory, or even just handling cleaning supplies at home.
At home even,
It's hazard communication.
yeah, those labels and data sheets,
Exactly.
people kind of overlook them sometimes, but they're really our first line of defense when it comes to working safely with chemicals.
I think it's so fascinating how the way we communicate about those hazards has evolved over time.
Yeah.
We've gone from this US-centric HCS system to the globally aligned GHS.
Mhm.
It's like switching from a regional dialect
Yeah.
to this universal language for chemical safety.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Right.
Yeah, and it makes sense in our increasingly interconnected world.
It really does.
It's like learning any new language. There are some challenges, but ultimately it leads to better communication and understanding.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, okay, before we get into the nuts and bolts of HCS and GHS, let's take a step back and talk about why clear hazard communication is so important in the first place.
Right.
What are the stakes here?
Well, miscommunication about chemical hazards, it can have some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah.
We've seen it tragically throughout history.
Yeah.
One example that comes to mind is the incident in Bhopal, India, back in 1984.
Oh, yeah.
A leak of toxic gas from a pesticide plant resulted in thousands of deaths and long-term health problems for so many more.
Yeah. That was just devastating.
It was, and investigations later revealed that inadequate safety procedures and just unclear hazard communication, played a significant role in the tragedy.
That's a really chilling reminder
Yeah.
of what's at stake when we talk about chemical safety.
For sure.
Okay, so let's bring in the key players here, OSHA and GHS.
Okay.
Can you give us a quick rundown of their roles and responsibilities?
Absolutely. So in the U.S., OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they've long been the authority on workplace safety,
Right.
including setting the standards for hazard communication. Their Hazard Communication Standard, or HCS, was kind of the go-to for years.
Right.
But as globalization increased and the movement of chemicals across borders became more common, the need for this unified system became very clear.
Right. Enter GHS, the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals,
Yes,
developed by the United Nations.
that's right.
So we have these two systems, HCS and GHS,
Uh-huh.
and you've been working with both of them for years now.
I have.
Where do you see the most significant differences?
One area where GHS really shines is in its specificity.
Okay.
HCS, while helpful, could sometimes be a bit vague in its classification of certain hazards.
Uh-huh.
For instance, under HCS, there wasn't a standardized test or criteria for classifying a substance as corrosive to metal.
Oh, wow. So imagine you're working with a new chemical and you need to know if it's going to eat through your storage container.
Exactly.
Under HCS, it might not be entirely clear.
No, it might not.
Wow.
GHS addresses this by introducing very specific testing methods and criteria based on corrosion rates. This means that no matter where you are in the world, if a chemical is classified as corrosive to metal under GHS, it's been tested and proven to corrode metal at a certain rate.
Wow.
This makes things much more consistent and predictable,
Right.
which ultimately reduces the risk of accidents.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So GHS is all about clarity and consistency.
Yes.
And speaking of clarity, let's move on to labels,
Okay.
which are often the first thing we encounter when dealing with chemicals.
Right, labels are like a quick snapshot of a chemical's hazards.
Yeah.
Both HCS and GHS emphasize performance-oriented labeling, meaning the focus is on effectively communicating the hazards to the user.
Got it. But GHS took that a step further, didn't
It
it?
did.
It added more structure and specific elements to ensure that information is communicated in a clear and standardized way.
You got it. GHS introduced 6 key elements that must be included on a label.
Okay, let's break those down for our listeners.
All right.
What's the first thing you'd see on a GHS label?
First up, you have the product identifier.
Okay.
This needs to match the safety data sheet, or SDS, and ideally any UN transport labels.
Okay.
This consistency is key for avoiding any confusion about what's inside the container.
Makes sense. You want everything to line up perfectly so there's no room for error.
Exactly.
What comes next?
Next, we have signal words, danger, or warning.
Ooh.
Think of those like attention grabbers.
Right.
Yeah.
Danger, pay close attention. This is serious.
Exactly.
And warning means you still need to be cautious, but maybe not quite as intense.
Exactly. Then we have hazard statements, which give a specific description of the hazard.
Okay.
For example, instead of just saying flammable, a hazard statement might say highly flammable, liquid and vapor.
So it gives you more specific information about how the hazard might manifest itself.
Precisely. And then because every good story has a solution, we have precautionary statements
Okay.
that offer advice on how to minimize risks.
Okay.
This might include things like keep away from heat spark soap and flame shot surfaces, or wear protective gloves, eye protection, face protection.
It's like having a mini safety manual right there on the label.
I like the way you think. And rounding out the label, we have the ever-important pictograms and supplier identification.
Okay, so the supplier identification is pretty self-explanatory, who made this stuff and how to reach them if you have questions.
Right.
But the pictograms, those are really cool, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. They're like mini safety posters. And they're fantastic for conveying hazards quickly, regardless of language barriers.
Yeah, and they're super eye-catching.
Yeah.
You see that flame symbol and you instantly know it's flammable.
Right.
Or the skull and crossbones and, it's toxic.
Exactly.
But I'm curious, how did HCS handle labels before GHS came along?
HCS had less specific requirements. Pictograms weren't mandatory, and the label information was generally less standardized.
Oh, okay.
This could lead to inconsistencies and confusion, especially when dealing with chemicals from different manufacturers.
So you might have two labels for essentially the same chemical,
Right.
but they look completely different and provide different levels of detail. That sounds like a recipe for trouble.
You're telling me GHS really helped to streamline and standardize labeling,
Yeah.
which in turn improves safety for everyone?
It sounds like GHS labels are leveling up the safety game.
Yes.
More information, more consistency, more visual cues.
For sure.
But what about those hefty data sheets?
Oh.
I know those can be intimidating for some people.
Oh, you mean the MSDS versus SDS saga?
Yeah.
GHS did away with the old material safety data sheet, or MSDS, and replaced it with the safety data sheet, or SDS.
And why the name change? What's the big difference?
Well, for starters, the SDS is much more comprehensive. It has 16 specific sections that delve into far greater detail than a typical HCS MSDS.
Wow.
SDSs are also globally standardized, making it easier to compare and understand safety information across different regions and suppliers.
So no matter where you are in the world, if you're looking at a GHS SDS,
Right.
you know exactly what information you're going to find and where to find it.
That's the beauty of it. It creates consistency and predictability, which is crucial when you're dealing with potentially hazardous materials.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's dive into some of those SDS sections and see what kind of information they hold.
Okay.
Let's start with Section 2, Hazard Identification.
Okay.
What makes this section so important?
Section 2 is like the executive summary of the SDS.
Okay.
It provides a detailed breakdown of the hazards associated with the chemical, including all relevant hazard classifications and GHS label elements, pictograms included.
Oh, wow.
It's your one-stop shop for understanding the key dangers associated with that particular substance.
So it's giving you a clear, concise overview of what you need to be aware of right up front.
Exactly.
That's super helpful.
Yeah.
What about the section on composition information on ingredients?
Okay.
How does GHS handle that differently from HCS?
GHS takes ingredient disclosure to a whole new level. It requires a complete breakdown of the chemical makeup, including not only the hazardous ingredients, but also impurities and stabilizing additives.
So we're not just talking about the active ingredients that make the chemical do its job,
Right.
but also everything else that's in there,
Right.
even in trace amounts.
Exactly. Transparency is key here.
Wow.
And remember, HCS primarily focused on the ingredients that contributed to the known hazards.
Okay, so GHS is giving you a more holistic view of what's actually in the chemical,
Exactly.
which can be incredibly helpful, especially for someone who might have sensitivities or allergies to certain ingredients.
Right. It's about empowering people with knowledge so they can make informed decisions about their safety.
All right, before we move on to the next section, I want to pause for a second and address our listeners directly.
Okay.
Sometimes looking at an SDS can feel a bit like deciphering a secret code.
Yeah, it can.
But trust me, the information in these documents is incredibly valuable for your safety.
Oh, yeah.
It's worth taking the time to familiarize yourself with the different sections and understand how to find the information you need.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power when it comes to safety.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about spills. Section 6, accidental release measures.
Okay.
What's in there that's so valuable for someone working with chemicals?
This section is your go-to guide in case of a spill or leak.
Okay.
It's like having a mini emergency response plan right there in the SDS.
Mm-hmm.
It provides step-by-step instructions on what to do, including details on containment cleanup procedures, personal protective equipment, and even environmental precautions to minimize any negative impact.
So if you find yourself in that unfortunate situation, you don't have to panic and try to figure things out on the fly.
Right.
You can just turn to Section 6 and follow the instructions.
Exactly. It helps ensure that accidents are handled quickly, safely, and effectively,
Right.
minimizing potential harm to people and the environment.
All right, that was a great overview of those first few sections of the SDS. We've
Yeah.
covered a lot of ground,
We have.
but there's still more to explore.
Oh, there is. And trust me, it's worth sticking around for.
We'll be back in the next part to delve deeper into the SDS and unpack even more valuable information for you.
Welcome back to Key Safety Talks, everyone. I hope you're ready for more, because we're about to dive deeper into the world of safety data sheets.
That's right. Last time we talked about why clear hazard communication is so crucial
Right.
and got a taste of how the GHS system has brought more standardization and specificity to chemical labeling and SDSs.
Yeah, and we started exploring some of the key sections of the SDS, like
Oh.
hazard identification and composition information on ingredients.
Hmm.
But that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. There's so much more to unpack.
Yes.
And it's all designed to help you, the listener, work with chemicals safely and confidently.
That's the goal.
So let's pick up where we left off today. I thought we'd focus on a few sections that are particularly relevant for those of you working directly with chemicals on a regular basis.
Okay.
Sections 8 and 9,
All right.
exposure controls, personal protection, and physical and chemical properties.
Sounds good.
These are sections I always pay close attention to when I'm reviewing an SDS for a new chemical.
As you should, they're packed with valuable information.
For sure.
Section 8, exposure controls personal protection. It's all about minimizing your exposure to potentially harmful substances.
Okay, so it's like a toolbox for staying safe on the job.
Precisely. It outlines engineering controls like ventilation system
Yeah.
that can help remove or dilute airborne contaminants. It also provides specific recommendations for personal protective equipment, or PPE.
So things like respirators, gloves, eye protection, and protective clothing.
So all that.
The SDS will actually tell you what type of PPE is appropriate for handling that specific chemical.
That's right. And what I really appreciate about GHS SDSs is that they often provide specific exposure limits,
Oh.
like OSHA PELs, ACGIH TLVs, and even other internationally recognized limits.
Wow.
These limits are based on scientific research
Okay.
and help employers establish safe working conditions.
It's like having a safety net.
Yeah.
You know, that if you stay within these limits, you're minimizing your risk of adverse health effects.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears and talk about Section 9, physical and chemical properties.
Okay.
Think of this section as a chemical's identity card. It outlines all its unique characteristics.
So we're talking things like boiling point, flash point, pH, color, odor, all those fun details, right?
You got it. And GHS SDSs tend to be more comprehensive here than HCS MSDSs.
Okay.
They'll provide details like partition coefficients, auto-ignition temperature, and decomposition temperature.
Wow.
This information may seem a bit technical,
Yeah.
but it's essential for understanding how a chemical will behave under different conditions.
And that knowledge can be critical for safe storage and handling, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You don't want to accidentally mix incompatible chemicals or store something flammable next to a heat source. We've all seen those videos on the internet.
Oh, absolutely. Those videos are a great reminder of why understanding a chemical's physical and chemical properties is so important. It's about preventing those oops moments before they happen.
For sure. Now, I know we've talked a lot about preventing accidents, but unfortunately accidents do happen.
They do.
That's why sectional-level toxicological information is so crucial.
Yes, this section gets into the nitty-gritty of the potential health effects that can occur if you're exposed to a chemical.
Right.
It can be a bit heavy,
Yeah.
but it's essential information to have.
Yeah. This is where the SDS really drives home the importance of those precautionary measures we talked about earlier, like wearing PPE and using proper ventilation.
Absolutely. GHS SDSs go into great detail here, covering not only the immediate symptoms of exposure, like skin irritation or respiratory problems,
Right.
but also long-term health effects, routes of entry into the body, target organs, and even data from animal studies.
So you're getting a really clear picture of the potential dangers, both short-term and long-term.
Yeah.
And that helps inform those precautionary measures and first aid procedures, right?
Exactly. The more you know about the potential risks, the better equipped you are to protect yourself and respond effectively in case of an emergency.
You know, one thing that always strikes me when I'm reading through this section of the SDS is just how much research and testing goes into understanding the potential health effects of chemicals.
Oh, for sure.
It's amazing to see the level of detail and scientific rigor that goes into this process.
I agree. It's a testament to the commitment to safety in the chemical industry,
Right.
and it highlights the importance of relying on credible sources of information like GHS SDSs rather than just Googling symptoms or trying to figure things out on your own.
Speaking of credible sources, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge all the amazing resources that are available to help people understand chemical safety.
Oh, yeah, there's a ton.
We've got OSHA, the EPA, NIOSH, so many organizations dedicated to providing guidance and support.
Don't forget about all the industry associations and professional organizations that offer training and resources as well.
So many
It
resources.
really takes a village to create a culture of safety.
It really does.
Yeah.
All right, let's get back on track with our SDS journey. We've got just a couple more stops before we wrap things up. What about sections 13 and 14? Disposal considerations and transport information.
All right. Section 13 is all about responsible disposal.
Okay.
It outlines the proper methods for getting rid of the chemical and its packaging once you're done with it.
Which is incredibly important.
Yeah.
We all have a responsibility to protect the environment and minimize any negative impact our actions might have.
Couldn't agree more. And then we have Section 14, transport information.
Okay.
This is where you'll find details on UN classifications, packaging requirements, and any special precautions that need to be taken when you're shipping or transporting hazardous materials.
So if you're a shipper or a truck driver, this section is your Bible.
It is.
It helps ensure that chemicals are transported in a way that minimizes the risk of accidents and spills.
Exactly. And it helps protect everyone involved in the transport process, from the people loading and unloading the trucks to the communities along the transportation routes.
Right, we're in the home stretch.
Right.
Before we wrap up our deep dive into SDSs, let's touch on one final section that's often overlooked. Section 15, regulatory information.
Oh, yeah.
What's the scoop on this one?
Section 15 is all about the legal stuff, the rules and regulations that govern the use, handling, storage, and disposal of that particular chemical.
So it's like a one-stop shop for compliance information.
You got it. It provides a rundown of all the relevant safety, health, and environmental regulations that apply to the chemical, both at the national and international levels.
This is especially helpful for companies that operate in multiple countries or states where the regulations might vary.
Absolutely. Section 15 helps ensure that everyone is on the same page and following the rules, which ultimately protects workers, the public, and the environment.
Okay, that was a whirlwind tour of the GHS SDS.
It was.
They've covered a lot of ground, from hazard identification to disposal considerations.
Yes, we have.
But before we move on, I want to reiterate that this is just a high-level overview.
Right.
SDSs can be complex documents, and it's always best to consult with a qualified safety professional if you have any questions or concerns.
I second that. Don't be afraid to reach out for help. It's always better to be safe than sorry.
All right, we'll be back in the next part to wrap up our discussion of GHS and explore some broader perspectives on hazard communication. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Key Safety Talks. I hope you've grabbed your favorite beverage and are ready for the final part of our GHS exploration.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the why behind clear hazard communication to the nitty-gritty of GHS labels and SDS sections.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey, hasn't it?
It has.
But before we wrap up, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the big picture impact of this transition from HCS to GHS.
You know, it's fascinating to think about how these changes have rippled through different industries and affected various stakeholders.
Absolutely. So let's break it down first up. Manufacturers, they've been on the front lines of this transition, haven't they?
They have, think about it, they've had to revamp their entire labeling and SDS creation processes to align with GHS requirements.
I imagine that's involved a lot of training, updating systems, and maybe even some head-scratching moments along the way.
Oh, for sure. It's been a significant adjustment, but, you know, when I talk to manufacturers now, many of them see it as a positive change overall.
Really? How so?
Well, GHS has really helped to level the playing field globally now. Instead of having to create different labels and SDSs for different countries, they can use a single standardized system for most of the world.
That makes a lot of sense. It simplifies things for them and makes it easier to export their products and compete in international markets.
Exactly. And when you consider the potential cost savings from streamlining those processes, it becomes even more appealing.
Okay, so manufacturers are seeing some benefits. What about employers? How has GHS impacted the folks who are actually using these chemicals day to day?
Well, just like manufacturers, employers have also had to adapt. They've had to make sure their workers are trained on the new GHS standards and that their workplaces are compliant with the updated regulations.
So we're talking about things like updating hazard communication programs, revising internal safety procedures, and maybe even investing in new PPE to meet those more specific requirements.
You got it. And I'm sure there have been some growing pains along the way, but When you talk to safety professionals, many of them will tell you that GHS has actually made their jobs a little bit easier in some ways.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, the standardized format of STSs makes it much easier to find the information they need quickly. And the use of pictograms has been a game changer for training. Those simple visual symbols can convey a lot of information quickly and effectively, even for workers who may not speak the language.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
It can really help to bridge those communication gaps and make sure everyone understands the hazards, regardless of their background or language skills.
precisely. And ultimately, that's what it's all about, creating a safer working environment for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of creating a safer environment,
Hmm.
let's not forget the most important stakeholders in all of this, the workers themselves.
Right. They're the ones on the front lines handling these chemicals every day.
And GHS has really empowered them, hasn't it? It's given them access to clearer, more consistent, and globally standardized information about the hazards they face.
Absolutely. That knowledge allows them to make more informed decisions, take appropriate precautions, and ultimately work more safely.
It's like giving them a voice, a way to advocate for their own safety and well-being.
That's a great way to put it. GHS has shifted the power dynamic a bit, putting more information in the hands of the workers and giving them the tools they need to protect themselves.
Okay, so it sounds like GHS has had a largely positive impact on hazard communication,
Mm-hmm.
but are there any downsides? I mean, no system is perfect, right?
That's true. Some critics argue that GHS can be overly complex, especially for smaller businesses that may not have dedicated safety personnel or the resources to navigate all the nuances of the system.
And then there's always the challenge of keeping up with updates and revisions as the system evolves.
That's another valid point. GHS is a living document, and it's constantly being refined and updated. Staying on top of those changes can be a bit of a headache, especially for global companies operating in multiple jurisdictions.
It sounds like a bit of a balancing act, right?
Yeah.
Trying to achieve global harmonization while also being flexible enough to adapt to local regulations and specific industry needs.
Exactly. But, even with its complexities, GHS has undoubtedly made the world a safer place.
It's remarkable to think that something as seemingly simple as a label or a data sheet can have such a profound impact on safety.
It really is. And it goes to show that even small changes, when implemented on a global scale, can make a big difference.
All right, as we wrap up our discussion on GHS today, I'd like to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. We've seen how this system has revolutionized chemical labeling and hazard communication, but what other areas of safety could benefit from a similar global harmonization effort?
That's a great question. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Think about it. What if we had universal symbols and standards for things like fire safety, electrical hazards, or even first aid procedures?
Yeah.
Could that help prevent accidents and save lives on a global scale?
It's certainly an intriguing idea. The success of GHS proves that global collaboration and standardization in safety are achievable.
And who knows, maybe someday we'll see a similar system in place for other hazards. But for now, we hope this discussion on GHS has been informative and helpful for you.
A huge thanks to all our listeners for tuning in to Key Safety Talks. We encourage you to check out the additional resources and visuals we've provided for a deeper understanding.
And remember, knowledge is power when it comes to safety. Stay informed, stay curious, and stay safe out there.